Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to this opening session of International Leadership Week 2021. We are the Institute of Leadership and Management, and I'm John Mark Williams, the Chief Executive, and I'm delighted to be opening a jam-packed week of webinars, podcasts, and LinkedIn Live sessions. This year, we're hosting 25 events from over the next 5 days with expert speakers from India, Brazil, Singapore, Canada, Poland, to name just a few, all discussing this year's theme of Leadership Reinvented. This topic is clearly important because we are in the throes of reinventing leadership, partly because of the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic over the past 2 years, and partly because innovation never stops, and that includes innovation in the ways of leadership. Our sessions this coming week will cover everything from mindfulness and meditation through remote and hybrid working to enterprise and empowerment. We'll talk about economy and society and how reinventing ourselves as leaders is just as important as reinventing our organizations to meet the challenge of change. This is a huge agenda. And earlier, I caught up with two specialists in seeing the shape of the future. To discuss the week ahead, I'm delighted to be joined by Economist, Trend Analyst and Futurist Bronwyn Williams, and by Global Futurist and CEO of Fast Future, Rohit Talwar. Welcome, Bronwyn and Rohit. So welcome, Bronwyn and Rohit, and thank you for being with us. There's almost a truism in saying this is a pretty good time to be talking about the future of leadership and leadership reinvented. We've had a huge amount of shift over the past couple of years in particular, not only in the way things are done, but the impact that has on how leadership is done. And I wonder if we could talk about some of those things in this conversation. Could we touch, first of all, one of the most obvious things with the shift to remote working and actually home working for many people, the shift from what was a centralized operation in terms of leadership, very often people were based in a particular geography wrapped around the leadership, to a decentralized functionality, I guess, in organizations. Bronwyn, if I can come to you first, how do you see that developing in the future and the impact of leadership on that?
Well, firstly, I just want to make a note on centralization versus decentralization, which I do think is one of the most interesting leadership topics at the moment. And quite often we try and conflate the ideas of centralization versus decentralization with the ideas of sort of authoritarianism versus more libertarianism. But I think that's a mistake, because an organization or a society can be both decentralized and control-based, or it can be centralized and freedom and trust-based. And I think that if you try and think about that almost in terms of a matrix rather than a linear scale, we can ask much better questions about the future of leadership. To sort of put that in a slightly even more simplified way, there's also the difference between the question of being a good leader and being a great leader, because of course greatness is not necessarily correlated with virtue, and goodness is not necessarily correlated with success. So I think that separating out this idea of centralization and decentralization also feeds into the goodness, greatness conversation about what sort of a leader do you want to be. And you mentioned this whole thing about remote work, and what I find fascinating about remote work in particular is that decentralization is highly correlated with increasing control and surveillance. So a physical decentralization is being coupled by a technological control and surveillance-based culture in our organizations. I think that this is a question that leaders really do need to think about very, very carefully, because essentially we have two different choices as leaders, and it's less to do with the physical structure of how you organize your organization, whether it's in hierarchy or whether it's in a sort of circular-based system. Rather, the bigger question that leaders need to ask is the difference between, are they building an organization that's based on trust, or are they building an organization that's based on control? And this is a very uncomfortable conversation, because sort of common wisdom, particularly in the Western world, has told us that things like freedom and growth go together. However, there's a very interesting paper that came out just, I think, this last week called AI-tocracy. You can go look it up if you like. And it's an economics paper, and it looks at how increasingly, as technology has evolved, authoritarianism and certain types of control-based technology are actually creating a sort of positive reinforcement loop, which it brings us to this very uncomfortable point in history where we are, whether we're looking at leadership at an organizational level or an international political level, that perhaps authoritarianism can work for growth going forward. It can, in other words, lead to greatness. The question then becomes if authoritarianism coupled with technology can lead to both goodness and greatness. And that's a very different question, which comes back to the key question for me, for your audience, which is which sort of an organization or which sort of a leader do you want to be? Do you want to be a control-based manager or a more trust-based leader going forward?
Really interesting that the difference between goodness and greatness, I think there. Rohit, having seen that shift for us from centralization to increasing decentralization, do you think that, in your experience, do you see leaders keeping up with, first of all, the impact of that shift on their actual leadership function? And secondly, do you see them grasping this idea of goodness or greatness are not necessarily the same things?
Absolutely. I think that particularly the latter, if we break this down into time periods, the first 12 months of the pandemic were really about getting the organization working in a decentralized manner, working out where the cracks were in our processes, working out how we could run with an organization that was largely remote in many cases. And so a lot of it was about surviving, just getting through, making sure we were doing the right things. We were still training. We were working how to lead when we can't see any of our people physically, working out how we create the water cooler conversations, how we can encourage people to still lean over their shoulder and ask someone something. How do we get new recruits into the organization and seeing the body language of the organization? Who talks to who? How's conflict dealt with? All of that's missing if you're just doing it by the screen. So that was a big enough agenda for the first 12 months or so. And gradually now we're starting to see organizations, and we've seen it over the last 6 months or so, starting to ask a different question, which is the one Bronwyn's been alluding to or talking about, which is, okay, where do we go from here? We've been a pretty good organization in keeping our people involved, not making too many redundant, and delivering to our clients. Where do we go from here? How do we get to great now? What does an organization need to do to be good or great in the world we're moving into? If we've got a sort of slightly schizophrenic in-out, decentralized, centralized model now, where everyone you talk to says, well, last week everyone was coming back into the office. Now we're saying it's 3 days a week. Next week, who knows? Which is a combination of health-related issues, pandemic-related issues, and just leadership-related issues too. Do I still want to manage an organization where I can't see anyone? Right. And I think there's a bit of human nature in that. So now we're seeing a lot of focus on how do I design the organization going forward? How do we work out what our business model is if we're operating differently? Do we just keep the same business model that we had before the pandemic, or do we start to evolve that? Do we start to take advantage of the fact that we have people working from home? I'll give you an example. I've just come back from Turkey, and you've got incredibly bright people who aren't getting jobs. I met a guy who was a PhD who was basically running the ticketing for the aerial lift in the middle of Istanbul. So this guy is incredibly well trained, but no opportunities. Now we can start to think about how do we work those into our organization, those people, and create a truly international model, whether I've got 5 in my team or 50,000. And so there's that conversation about what are the right models going forward. Therefore, what are the right kinds of business models? How do we do business? How do we charge? Suddenly people are seeing the value of the crypto economy as a mechanism for charging, just because there are people who want to spend with crypto. So it doesn't matter whether I like it or not. there are people willing to pay me, and why wouldn't I take their money and then instantly convert it to pounds or dollars or whatever? But learning to adapt to those things, I think, is key, and learning to work out how you create the sort of weft and weave of an organization where it is largely digital now. How do you create those human connections? How do you sustain them? How do you deal with the fact that a 21-year-old working from their bedroom now feels that's very stale, and they've done it, they've had enough, they need to have human contact? Similarly, a 50-year-old just wants to be around their work friends again. How do we create that going forward? And finally, that, which I think we'll come on to, which is that piece of, where do I find my inspiration? Again, whether I'm running a 5-person business or a 2,000-person business, where do I as a leader find my ideas, my inspiration? I used to go to networking events. I'm a little bit more reluctant to do that now. I maybe attended conferences or whatever. How do I have those conversations? Who's feeding me new ideas? Who's challenging my thinking? Because I can't turn to my colleagues to do that, because I don't want to say things like, I don't know, or I'm scared of that. But I can go to a group where, a bit like a kind of 12-step program, I can meet a whole bunch of people who are struggling with that. And so I think those are some of the things that we're seeing leaders trying to work out how to navigate going forward.
Excellent, thank you very much. Bronwyn, just before we go on to that, where do I get my inspiration? Because I think that's something we need to touch on later. Can I just pick up one of the points that Rohit made around business models? And one of the things, in addition to the shift from centralization to decentralization that we've seen, is the sort of blurring of the boundary between the public sector and the private sector, which historically have had very different business models, public good to come out of the public sector, pure profit out of the private sector. What do you think's happening, and how is it impacting on leadership as we get this melding of the two?
Well, I think that's a great point. And of course, it does definitely make sense with what we see is going on in the world right now. We see the very biggest companies in the world have bigger economies, like the economy of my own country. South Africa is a lot smaller than some of the economies of some of these very, very big businesses. But up until to date, or at least up until rather recently, there has been a separation of the powers between the world of business and the world of the state. So we tried to separate power from money. And that's basically the sort of social contract with which we tried to develop our sort of post-World War II democratic world in the countries that are sort of lucky enough to be democracies. But as companies have become that powerful, because money is not a direct sort of substitute for power, but it is a fairly reasonable sort of proxy for power in a certain extent, we can start to see that we've got these very, very big businesses that are now sitting on international governing bodies and having sway, perhaps even the same amount of sway as some of the smaller actual nation state countries leaders might have. And that, of course, does upset this whole dynamic, which makes us really have to start thinking in the future as to what you are actually leading if you are a leader. And at the same time that businesses, particularly very, very big businesses, are stepping into that governance role, we also see governments putting pressure onto smaller businesses in order to get involved with things like corporate social investment, for example, and to push businesses away from the pure profit motive, for better or for worse. I do have some questions about that, being a trained economist myself, about the merging of incentives that happens when we as authorities try and incentivize businesses to act against their own material interests. We have to expect that perhaps sometimes those incentives might lead to some unintended consequences. So I think we're going to see quite a few unintended consequences that come from the blurring of those lines, but it's also worth speaking about what's happening with governments themselves. As we have moved away from the sort of neoliberal consensus, we are moving into an era where there is more of a move towards nationalization and socialization across most of the democratic and formerly capitalist neoliberal world. We are starting to see businesses or governments get involved with the running of various businesses, whether that's through sort of state-owned enterprises, whether that's through sort of more interventionist policies into our economies. What we are really seeing is that the former referee who previously set the rules of the business game is now kind of getting into the field and actually kicking that ball him or herself, which again does conflate some of those incentives. So what we are going to see when incentives get blurred and those sort of clear lines of command and responsibility get merged, we do see conflict, as we're almost going to have a sort of turf war between what is the mandate of business, what is the mandate of government. And we are kind of seeing a merger there, which should be slightly concerning for most of us who do understand 20th century history. Most of the great sort of, shall we say, socio-economic and political troubles of the last century happened when we had too much of a merger between both capital and power interests. Unfortunately, I would say that there's going to be some sort of period of conflict coming up as we try and renegotiate those lines of who is in charge of what. But I also just wanted to layer another sort of point on there, because I have been looking also from a very macro sort of perspective at the moment at sort of sketching out almost I'm calling it 4D geopolitics model, which I think speaks to this blurring again once again. And here I'm talking about how previously, because we didn't have things like technology, like digital banking systems, geopolitical sort of agreements and treaties were drawn up, tied very much to the material plane, shall we call it. So the world of sort of muscle, trade was very physical, boundary lines were drawn due to sort of actual armies fighting for actual territory. And then as the sort of time moved on, we add another layer to that, and that's the world of finance or money, the sort of second layer in this sort of 4-layer model that I'm trying to sketch for you. And what's interesting about the world of money laid onto the world of muscle or materialism is that the flows of money and monetary alliances, the sort of financial alliances, don't map completely neatly onto territorial boundaries, right? So you might have countries that would have trade agreements with one party, but might have a military alliance with someone else. And more recently, we've laid another 2 layers on top of that, which has made this geopolitical chess game that much more complicated. And the same trends are playing out domestically between sort of turf battles between businesses and more sort of localized governmental powers. I think that's worth mentioning. But the other 2 layers that we built onto that are the layers of medium. That is the ability to communicate. So that would be our sort of digital infrastructure, or our very big tech companies would fit into that space too. The big platforms like your Facebooks and your Twitters that once again do not have a direct geopolitical interest tied to a physical territory. And this is what I find very, very fascinating when you've got companies that we seem to believe to be, say, American-based or domiciled that are sort of, adopting speech and censorship regulations from political powers that might be very misaligned with their territorial governments, which I find absolutely fascinating. Or you've got sort of like basketball teams that are censoring their players based on a foreign powers sort of dictation on what is permissible speech or not. And laid on top of that confusion, we've got the 4th layer, which is also once again out of alignment with everything else. And that's the layer of meme or message. And this is the sort of cultural influence that we have that spills across boundaries, across physical borders, across financial borders, and across that sort of platform-based borders. And that's how the world sort of changes. And when we start to sort of layer those 4 sort of lines of power on top of each other, we start to see that the boundaries that governments can control really only speak to the bottom 2. Governments are largely losing control of those top 2 layers on this multi-dimensional chess game that's playing out. The worlds of medium and the worlds of message, because information cannot be contained to a physical border. And that's why going forward, I think another big leadership trend we're seeing is that the only way to sort of control all of those 4 layers is to start looking at all 4 of them on the one hand, and also to start looking at a more international level. So the sort of breakdown as to the sort of mandates of power, both in the business and the public sector space, and also into who's in charge of what on a geopolitical space, is going to make the future once again an interesting place, for better or for worse.
Very, very interesting, fascinating, in fact. And Rohit, that actually sets the scene very nicely for this question of where do I get my inspiration from, bearing in mind the context that we're talking, which is not just the local, which it used to be much more impact locally, but at the global level, because leadership is influenced now by all of these things that Bronwyn has been talking about. How do leaders get their inspiration, and where do they get it from?
I think there are a number of different ways in which leaders can start to bring new ideas into the organization and challenge their own thinking. And the first is you have to be willing to challenge the assumptions you have about how your organization operates, how you make money, the things you are willing to do versus the things you weren't. And it's forcing people to reconsider everything from, for example, just charging per purchase to looking out there and discovering that subscription models have become a way of locking your customer in. So you don't sell aircraft engines, you sell power. That you no longer provide on-the-spot maintenance to a client of something you've sold them or a product. You're giving them the product for free effectively, and you're then delivering that service continually, whether it's a human service or a physical product you're providing. To then get those ideas, I think we have to do three things. Firstly, we have to look at who our stakeholders are. They're the people that we're going to take seriously because they feel like they're in the here and now with us. That's our customers, that's our suppliers, that's our competitors, and to some extent our employees. And I think that's the one that's been underutilized. And then where you have a non-executive board, listening to them because they're bringing challenge in. The second piece is really looking out there with a wider lens at just what is changing today, because what could be someone's today could be something I do in 2 years' time. So things like artificial intelligence, we're seeing more and more people using the tools, others not even understanding it. And so that implies getting the education, really making sure that we're investing in our own literacy about how the business world is changing, how competitors are changing what they do, how customers are changing the way they're behaving, and the kind of needs they have. And at the moment we see this sort of radical shift towards automating every process at speed with things like robotic process automation, where the individual staff members are automating their own processes. So understanding the speed at which that's happening and the extent to which companies are wanting to hand off more and more responsibility to their suppliers, I think is very important, because now wrapped around the product or service we're providing, customers also want information, whether it's about the provenance of what we've offered them, or it's about the way it was actually manufactured, and really starting to have to provide a lot more information, the green credentials, whatever. And then the third piece is that idea of stepping into the future, scanning the horizon for what might be coming. That can be daunting because there's so much content out there, and people like Bronwyn and myself, are masters at flooding the universe with more and more content about what might change. And so learning to develop those filters, learning to scan but identify the kinds of things that are most important for you. So it might be about markets and how they might change. It might be about how companies are adapting to new technologies. It might be about what's coming next and new ideas. And I would bring you back to that conversation about government. One of the things we see now within government is this desperate search for revenue. We've all had to pay a lot of money to deal with the cost of the pandemic, whether it's furlough schemes, whether it's mass vaccination, putting out personal protective equipment, whether it's track and trace. All those things have cost a fortune. In the UK, we're talking about £300 billion. We need to find that money back somewhere. And so the levers we already know about, like charging you for a visa, but if people weren't traveling, then that was an issue. Encouraging you to renew your passport months before it was due so we could get the money in quicker. But then starting to look at, well, where else is there in society where there are money flows where government can interject itself? So we can see that 10, 20 years out, it will be common for governments to say to businesses, look, you are making an incredible amount of money out of an automated process that uses AI, you're employing very few people, you're managing to pay very low taxes. We are going to interject ourselves there and actually take a robot tax or whatever you want to call it. We're going to take an additional chunk of revenue. And in extreme cases, we might even own the intellectual property and license it back to you. So that's further down the line. But right now, for individual businesses, I think there's all sorts of interesting ways to say, actually, let's go to government and offer them a service where we will find issues for them and they will make money out of the fines that go with those issues, and we'll share the fine between the government and that provider. I'll give you a very simple example now. Right now, we have all these regulations around the use of personal data. And it's really hard to track whether millions of businesses are actually being good citizens, good corporate citizens. The people who know they're not are often the customer, who gets a sense that their data is being misused, but they don't have the power to do that. So we can start to create services that, using technology again, that monitor how all these businesses are using our data. And if we find they are, just automatically have government impose a fine on them and give us a percentage of that for doing it. And in the future, the one that I think was really interesting, it came up in Turkey this week, where I was talking to a group of academics in the field of AI. One of the ones that they're really interested in is this idea that do you have the right to die digitally? So when we die, all our data lives on potentially in the universe, and Facebook and Google and everyone can still make money out of it and keep exploiting it because they can feed that into these big machine learning sets and predict behaviors, even though we're dead, and we're not getting anything back from that. So could we create data services that basically say, once your death has been registered, can we go out and make sure that companies have cleaned us up, have taken us off their systems, and if they haven't, do we then apply a fine? And suddenly you generate this whole new revenue stream in society, which will be massive, absolutely massive. And then the other one I would just say is governments looking at crypto. So you're seeing a lot of countries creating central bank digital currencies, but an awful lot just buying crypto. And today, I mean, the prices have dropped. You'll imagine them buying more because you're seeing them wipe out their debt because of the appreciation and value of the crypto they've got. Quite often it's been seized from illegal actors, and they basically use that to pay off. And you're seeing governments encouraging citizens and businesses to use crypto. So El Salvador has given around $30 to every citizen and mandated every business of a certain size has to accept crypto. So they're really starting to drive change, and then they'll take the taxes in crypto. And their hope is that they can grow revenues for the nation and ultimately reduce themselves from dependency on donor nations. So there's an incredible shift going on. And the question for businesses now is, whatever my size, how can I inject ourselves into some of those new money flows, create some of those new opportunities, where I think government has never been more willing to look for ways of generating revenue. So if we can take great ideas to them and we don't have millions and millions of pounds of consultancy fees attached to it, how can we take advantage of that?
Very interesting. And the idea of the right to die digitally is quite interesting, because it might be that we want to retain the right to live digitally after we die, so that our estate continues to benefit from the things that companies are making. I think this is obviously the sort of conversation that could go on forever. I think there's one particular point I'd be interested in hearing from both of you about this. You mentioned data, Rohit, essentially, and I think data, maybe we would agree, is pretty much the foundation for the future, because more that we see of the way that society works, the more it is based around the collection and analysis and then use and utilization of data. If that's the foundation for the future, what does this mean for example, for new business models? What does it mean for combinations of government and business operating together? Not so much how do we charge for the data, but actually, do you think that leadership is actually going to be able to keep up in terms of development of leaders with the plethora of data that's being developed and the opportunities for use of that? What's the impact, you think, on future leadership development of that data dependency? Bronwyn, any thoughts on that?
Well, I suppose that depends how you look at it, because data is just data. It's just a tool, right? It's how you actually mine that to get something useful out of it that makes it valuable as a commodity within your organization and your organizational structure. That said, much of the data usage going forward is becoming more and more automated through things like inferences, even through algorithms, through AI, all the rest of it, which means that actually you don't really need to keep ahead of it. You just need to keep feeding the beast. Which is why whenever we hear the word data going forward, what we're really talking about is surveillance and the shrinking opportunity for customers and citizens to opt out of being surveilled in almost every aspect of our lives. I think one of the biggest sort of leadership challenges, particularly in the public sector going forward, is the fact that we have not even fully understood what's happened post World War II, again, which is quite obviously a pivotal point for human society at large, in that was really when we started to see the beginnings of the welfare state that we have right now, that is really growing in power across the world. But the big thing that happened back then was the institution of things like national healthcare, which had obviously never really been had before. Previously, healthcare, even if it was sort of centralized to some degree, was still done by the private sector. And what we have not fully understood yet is that as soon as the state is responsible for paying your bills, the state actually owns your biology, which means you don't have a right to opt out of sharing data or sharing any information or any actual instructions to do with your physical body, as long as someone else is paying for it. Because if in effect, if society is paying for the maintenance on this frail sort of form that we walk around with, they have a right to say what you do with it, because obviously risk comes into that. And if risk is socialized, then so should your behavior. And what this basically means is that I think governments and states are starting to wake up, and companies too, because obviously companies interact with customers and are trying to use data to more preferentially price or to have price discrimination, which means that in order to price anything, be that health insurance, be that taxes, be that an insurance policy, whatever it may be, you're going to demand data to make sure that price is as close to perfect as possible, particularly as economies start to slow down with regards to things like degrowth mandates. You know, if you've got less, if you are literally mandating degrowth and shrinking, you're going to have to make do with more competition. More competition comes with more conflict, which means comes with more rules and restrictions, which means that you will increasingly not be able to opt out of sharing information on just about anything, because quite frankly, it's in everyone else's interests what you do with your life. But the sort of more dystopian scenario there is that it is entirely totalizing. There is no domain of the public self that can remain private in a world that has become socialized on the risk front. So that's something we're going to have to grapple with as a species, that the question of whether individuals can survive the future is wide open at the moment. And it comes back to the very first point I made between sort of what sort of society, what sort of business do you want to develop? A control-based business or a more trust-based business or society? And that's what we're really talking about here. The right to remain anonymous, the right to withhold any part of your physical or intellectual property back from the collective is the perhaps challenge of leadership going forward, because there is always a collective demand upon the individual. And now that we have the ability to track, trace and surveil that individual, to put that data into the collective pot, the justification to remain opting out of that system is going to become more and more frowned upon, particularly as expenses increase and people are encouraged to do their part to both fund increasing budgets going forward, but also to do their part to reduce their contribution to things, in other words, to the continued degradation of the planet. And as those sort of forces come together, yes, data is going to have to be shared, centralized and controlled more and more if we're going to deal with those sort of twin challenges of both growth and sustainability.
Bronwyn, thank you very much indeed. And Rohit, this is very interesting, because what's emerging here is particularly thinking about not just business models, but actually the way the world works, as Bronwyn was just articulating there, reminds me of Theodore Levitt's article in 1967 about marketing myopia and the question, what business are we in? The question, I guess, becomes, what business are we in as leaders, as countries, as companies? Actually, what is the business of society in terms of government and private sector, and what is the leadership responsibility that goes with that?
Great questions, and I think where we would start is that understanding of society. Whether you're a small business or a government, how do we understand how society is changing, what it places value on, and then how do we get the data to help us tailor, whether it's our products and services as a business, our distribution strategy, or as governments, how do we tailor services, but also how do we make money out of what's interesting to society and the data we might have. And let's start with government for a second. Government has all sorts of information, and right now it doesn't necessarily know how to use that. So for example, it has better and better information through sensors on the street to know exactly how many people walk past every shop. In the UK, we have more surveillance cameras than anywhere in the world. We know how many people walk across a crossing. We use that to plan things like traffic flows and widening of pavements, but we don't sell that to retailers to say, actually, we can give you information that can help you best place where you put your shops and your next outlet, and where should you close them because visitor numbers are reducing. And so there's those kinds of things. We have so much data that we can exploit. At the individual business level, we're also learning that our data is our most valuable tool in many respects. So we hear this a lot, that let's say you're a repair garage, you know when customers come in, but you don't really record it in that kind of way. You know they come in to get their bike repaired or their car MOT'd. You often don't use the information to then go back and remarket to those customers. But if you have that data, you know when they come back, you know what kind of additional services they buy when they come back because you have a chat with them. Well, you can start to use that data to spread out across the course of the year information to those people, special offers, and we start to get better in doing that. The challenge, I think, is around digital literacy. Understanding what data is, understanding what the technologies are that are coming through, understanding what AI is. We encourage everyone we work with to go and have a look at an offering from the University of Helsinki and the Finnish government called the Elements of AI. And it's 6 modules that teach people the basics of AI for free. And what we find is that without that level of understanding of what data is and what AI is, you have a lot of fear-based and fact-free conversations. Once people start to inform themselves, they can have a much better sense of what they can do with their data and how to understand the world around them and how to use the technologies. But not just the leaders, but a key role of leadership here is encouraging that increase in literacy and digital literacy in particular amongst the workforce. And so very simple things that can start to feed new data to people are things like encouraging everyone to watch 10 minutes of videos a day on the web. Thousands of new videos every day, 2 or 3 minute videos about what's changing. You suddenly create whole new sources of information, whole new conversations when you change what's influencing people, you change what they're seeing. We've seen the sort of disastrous side of TikTok and social media where people have got the, we're injecting you with transmitters that then allow you to talk to, people on another planet to monitor your every thought, or Bill Gates to control your buying behavior. So we've seen all of that. So we've seen the negative side, but the positive side is when we give people new ideas, they spread like a virus as well. And so we grow the quality of information people are taking in. And I think all of this feeds back to a leader then saying, how do we become more and more of a data-based organization that is gathering the right data, that is interpreting it in useful ways, that is engaging staff in that interpretation, and then is using it to create value, whether it's how we run the operation, whether it's how we deal with existing customers, or going out and finding new business. So data becomes critical to all that, but you need the education, you need the understanding, and you need to take data as seriously as you do regulatory requirements or a customer order. And I don't think today we still prioritize data and technology enough. When our IT person comes to talk to us, instantly you see the body language change, that feeling that it's going to cost you a lot of money. And then the first thing we talk to them about is not the big ticket item that they're saying we need to do in order to grow new business. It's, well, my PC isn't working, or the network was a bit slow yesterday. And so there's some challenges there as well around how we value the information technology, how we change the information technology function, how we change its capabilities to work better with the organization, and finding the right skill sets to teach the organization about how to use data well and how to value it and how to protect it. And then that takes you into that whole ethical space about, well, how much do we use data? What should we use? And responding, then the final point I would say is learning how to respond to pressures in the marketplace, because right now what we're seeing is customers saying, I don't like the idea that you can change my data. Yesterday I had £5,000 in my bank account. Today I seem to have 3,000. You've changed something. The second is to make it super secure so that no one else can hack it. The third piece is to make it immutable so no one can change it, which is really the first bit, but literally no one can change it. And the fourth bit is making it totally transparent. Now, for the last few years, we've been hearing about blockchain technology, but most businesses have said, well, we can't find an application for it. Suddenly, we're realizing that blockchain technology actually gives us all those things. And so understanding that and starting to think about how do we move our application to the blockchain starts to change our mindset around how we run our business, how we create visibility, and how we really protect our data as a core resource.
Rohit and Bronwyn, thank you very much. This has been a fascinating discussion. We touched on the centralization and decentralization challenge, I think, that's emerged over the past few years in particular, the parallel blurring of the boundaries between public and private sector. We've talked about what that means and then what it requires in contextual awareness in leaders, particularly in the fact that all of that is at the same time changing all the time. And the resultant requirement for us to understand there are new business models already at play here and continually will be needed in the future, not just for organizations and for companies, actually for whole societies, in fact. And I think that sets the tone beautifully, actually, for the 25 sessions that we've got in our International Leadership Week coming up. Everything that from mindfulness to remote working to data to leadership learning. You have managed to set the scene beautifully for that, I think. So my profound thanks to you, Bronwyn, and to you, Rohit, for a really, really fascinating session. I am quite sure that there is a lot more that we could say about this, but I think we've done a pretty good job to start the week. Thank you both very, very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Bronwyn and Rohit, for a really thought-provoking and enlightening discussion. I'm excited for the week ahead and looking forward to some fascinating discussions and real insights. Make sure you log on to our website, www.institutelm.com, to reserve your place at any of our upcoming events. All the events are free to access, and you can always continue the discussions on the Hub on our website. The Hub is our community forum for leaders and managers at all levels. Getting involved is free, and you don't need to be a member of the Institute to join the Hub. We hope that you really enjoyed this week. Our aim is that you'll find actionable insights, practical advice, and essential strategies related to all organizations across all levels of leadership. So with that, I would like to thank our guests again, Bronwyn Williams and Rohit Talwar, and to give a special mention to this year's sponsors, Belbin and Edinburgh Business School, and to thank you all for listening. I'll leave you with some highlights of the week ahead and look forward to seeing you all later this week.
Hello, this is Mark Busman speaking. I'll be attending the International Leadership Week, and hopefully you will do so as well. I'll be talking about the difference between a complicated versus a complex world. Do you know actually the difference? And do you also understand what it means on how to work with those themes? Join me for the session and be inspired.
I'm so pleased to be involved in International Leadership Week because as we're emerging from the pandemic, we are all reevaluating how we do business, what work is going to be like, and how our careers are going to progress. This is the liminal moment when we can be reevaluating everything. So I'm excited to be here with you as we ask the hard and probing questions.
I'm excited for the potential of leadership to turn the unexpected into positive outcomes. And I think the unexpected is shaping our future and the future of our organizations. And this Leadership Week will be an exceptional guide in this regard.